Welcome back. Sam Spinella, your trusted real estate guy. So welcome back. So last week, what we talked about was the biggest mistakes when you're in contract, the biggest mistakes that a buyer or seller can make. So this week, what I wanted to talk about were the fixes. So this week's fix, the 3 contracts and contingencies that save you. So one thing that I talked about last week is how it's very difficult to get into trouble, and also there's some very big mistakes that you can make when you are purchasing or selling a home. So as far as contracts, a lot of people don't realize this, and which is one of those things you don't pay attention to. So there are actually 3 separate contracts that are involved inside of the real estate transaction, and that's just on the face of it, not to mention the addendums and the other contracts that you actually go into during the contract itself. So during the RPA, or the residential purchase agreement, that's the one where everybody's kind of married together. So first you're going to have the listing agreement, and the listing agreement is going to be between the seller and the seller's agent, or the listing agent. Inside of that agreement is going to be explicit directions, and it should be explicit directions on how long the agreement lasts, and that should be a conception date and an end date. It should also have anything that is going to be reimbursed, is going to be anything that the agent is going to do for you. So regardless of what you think that might involve, you always want to make sure you have it in writing. If it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. And even though things can seem wonderful when you get started inside of a contract or a relationship, any relationship for that matter, you want to make sure that you are making all of the changes inside of that agreement in writing. So I was just looking at my mic. I want to make sure my mic is working. Testing 1, 2. Yeah, so it looks like it's working. Okay, so that's the listing agreement. So the listing agreement is going to be there for the seller along with the listing agent. And then you're going to have the buyer broker agreement. So, and I'm just going to go high level because this has the ability to get very, very detailed and just very long and drawn out and arduous. The next is going to be the buyer broker agreement, or the BBA. So the buyer broker agreement is going to be what happened back in August 17th of 2024, and has now been in law for a year. So, and that's the clear cooperation rule. So the buyer broker agreement has actually always been there. It's always been something that's been available to us to use. However, more recently, over the last year, this has been a rule where we have to use it. If you're representing a buyer as an agent, you have to have a buyer broker agreement. So that buyer broker agreement is going to be, that's going to have the same thing. It's going to have a timeline. When does it start? When does it end? It's also going to have kind of the biggest piece to it is going to state how much the buyer is willing to pay the buyer's agent if the seller refuses to pay that. So how much is the buyer willing to pay the seller, the buyer's agent's fee or concessions if the seller is not willing to pay that? Up to this point, it's always been expected that the seller will pay that. However, it's always been up for negotiations, and it still is up for negotiations. And then finally, the last contract is the RPA, the residential purchase agreement. Now, I'm specifically speaking for California. All states can be different. Not all the rules are the same in all the states. But California is a non-lawyer or non-attorney state, meaning that we don't have to have an attorney to close out the transaction. So it is a little bit, it can be a little different that way. Midwest, East Coast, they tend to be an attorney state or a lawyer state where you have to have lawyers draw up the documents. California, we have lawyers draw up the documents. It's called the CAR contract, and the California Association of Realtors, attorneys beat the life out of us with that CAR contract. So we have everything dialed in already. Now, with that said, inside the residential purchase agreement, this is going to have the specific guidelines. As a buyer, you're making the offer to the seller. So the offer being made to the seller is going to have some specific guidelines inside of it. Same type of thing. How long is this offer good for? So it's first going to look at how long is the offer good for. Second, you're going to see what type of purchase or price is the buyer offering. And then it's also going to go into how long is the contract going to be until it closes. What is the offer date? So if we make an offer today, how long does it stay until it expires? And so let's say that we have an offer put in today and we expire tomorrow or expire tonight. The seller has to move quick on that. And there's going to be strategies around all the different things that we do. So if the seller has to move fast, the seller has to come back with an answer quickly, let's say 12 hours, 24 hours, whatever it is. But if that offer expires, then it goes into another state that we have to talk about as well, another position that we have to talk about as well quickly. And that is if the offer expires and the seller decides to accept that offer after it expires, we then need to do an addendum where everybody signs stating that they agree, buyer and seller both agree that now they're accepting this offer even though it expired. That becomes sticky if it was not done and something comes up later on as far as a buyer or a seller wanting to get on a contract. So inside of that residential purchase agreement, there's going to be contingencies, and those contingencies are four. One is going to be contingent upon selling the buyer's home. We rarely ever do see that, but that is a contingency that's there. The three more common contingencies are going to be a loan contingency, an appraisal contingency, as well as an inspection contingency. So with those contingencies, we have to make sure that we work within the rule of the law as far as those contingencies go. Each contingency, and there's other contingencies as well, these are the main three ones. So each contingency has got to perform by itself with its own deadline. If you're not working within those contingencies and you fall out of contract and you're not doing anything, if your agent is not doing anything to make sure that everybody is continuously on the same page in contract, in writing, then that can come back and bite you as well. So these are things that you have to pay attention to. And those are the three main contracts that we pay attention to and that we have to watch out for. The deadlines, specific deadlines are going to be the offer of expiration, the contingency periods. Each contingency is going to have its own deadline and period. And that can be the inspection, the appraisal, and the loan. It can also be the appraisal, the loan, the title, HOA doc, the HOA doc review, along with buyer's home sale. And we talked about that. So you want to make sure that you are actively removing contingencies as you move through, whether you're the buyer or the seller, but both need to pay attention to this. And it's very important because once you are technically out of contract, then things can get sticky very quickly. In California, we also agree that we'll go to arbitration. Ultimately, we agree that we'll go to arbitration. We won't go automatically to court. So if we go to arbitration, arbitrator is not something that you want to see. They're usually going to be a retired attorney or retired judge. And the arbitrator's job is literally to make sure that nobody's happy. So we don't want to go to arbitration. That's not where we want to end up. That's not where we want the clients to end up. And then inside of the contract, the residential purchase agreement, everybody's involved. So the buyer is bringing this to the seller. The buyer's agent's bringing this to the seller's agent. But ultimately, it's the buyer and the seller who are in contract together. And the agents are making sure that they're giving the guidelines and they're giving guidance to the buyer and the seller to make sure that we're performing properly, to make sure everybody's performing properly and playing the game in the right way, being fair, and making sure we're not breaking the rules. That's going to be the main point of all of it. The contingencies, inspection and due diligence, and this comes up all the time. So for the inspection contingency, what happens, and whenever I speak with somebody who's even in California but in a different area, Silicon Valley, they'll say, hey, you have no contingencies whenever you get into contract. And that's actually true. Many times a buyer will bring no contingencies to a purchase in Silicon Valley. And the reason being is that it moves so fast, and typically offers are accepted very quickly. And so offers being accepted very quickly, a non-contingent offer is going to be more attractive to the seller. being more attractive to the seller, one of the things the sellers do, and that we do as listing agents, is we do the inspections up front by licensed inspectors to make sure that everything is taken care of as far as the seller expecting and knowing what's there. And then as far as the buyer having that understanding and signing off on it before they make the offer. So that's the inspection. And then when you look at the appraisal and the loan, more or less, you can look at a property and say, okay, it's going to appraise for the asking price or for the price that we're in contract at, or it's going to go a little bit over or under. We can usually kind of gauge that. So many times the buyers will come in with no contingency for appraisal, inspection, and loan. That's going to be on the buyer. So the buyer is going to go to a loan officer ahead of time. That's why we say get pre-approved ahead of time. Get pre-approved ahead of time so you can write an offer that's a strong offer. Even if you do have to have a contingency on the loan, make sure that it's a short contingency with a loan officer who has got a good reputation. Loan officer or bank that's got a good reputation. Those are the main things that you're looking at and that you want to pay attention to. The preliminary report is going to be available as well, and that's going to be one of the things that the buyer signs off on. Seller also signs off on that. HOA docs. HOA docs can take some time. So when we order the HOA docs, we want to make sure we're ordering those ahead of time to make sure that they're available for the buyer to see before we actually get into contract, if possible. Sometimes it's not possible, but typically it is. Now, if a buyer is pulling out of contract because of one of the contingencies, we want to make sure that that contingency is actually being used and they're not pulling out of contract because of something else that happened. So that's certainly something that we have to pay attention to as well. So what you want to remember is inside of the contracts, who is it that represents you? If you're the buyer, your buyer's agent is representing you. If you're the seller, your seller's agent or your listing agent is representing you. If you're a buyer, you need to sign that buyer broker agreement to make sure that you understand the length of time, and you also understand how things are going to work inside this agreement with your agent. So you want to have an agent who does go over the buyer broker agreement with you, and also somebody who's going to go over the residential purchase agreement with you and understand and know what do we have to watch out for here. How is there a pitfall here? Is a downfall there? How are we lined up as far as time goes? And then you also have to talk about negotiations. And maybe we'll talk about negotiations on the next video, but ultimately these are the things that we're watching out for. Those are the main contingencies that we're watching out for. And we want to make sure that whoever you're working with, whether you're working with your buyer's agent or your listing agent, your seller's agent, one way or the other, you want to make sure you're working with somebody you feel comfortable with. You want to make sure that you're working with somebody who communicates with you and also who you feel comfortable to communicate with. These things are very important because once you are going through this process of purchasing or selling a property, it gets very intense very quickly. You're talking about a lot of money on the line, and you want to make sure that whoever you're working with is able to help you navigate themselves, and also navigate everybody else around you. Because many times it's not just you that's in the hot seat. It can be your spouse. It can be your brother, sister. It can be everybody else coming at you, uncle who's never owned a property, but he's got a really big idea of what property is going to happen or what's going to happen to property and values of property over the next year. People like that all the time. We're always going to have that third base coach. But here's the deal. At the end of it all, you want to make sure you're working with somebody you're comfortable with, and you want to make sure that you are working with somebody who knows what they're doing and is competent in what they're doing. I'm always here and happy to help. If you have any questions about real estate at all, please feel free to reach out. I'm always here and happy to help. Sam Spinella, 408-393-9294. Talk to you soon.